March 12th, 1945, Camp Beale, California. The vibration came first, a low rumble through the packed dirt that felt wrong. It wasn't the throaty cough of a Chai-Ha tank or the high whine of a Zero. It was a deep, steady growl. Nurse Emmy Tanaka pressed closer to the wire, the metal links cool against her forehead, a sharp contrast to the dry California heat. The dust cloud resolved into an olive-drab 2.5-ton GMC truck, braking hard near the supply depot. The engine cut, and the sudden silence was filled by the click-clack of the driver's door opening. A figure swung down from the cab. Emmy's breath caught. It was a woman. She wore men's denim trousers, rolled at the cuff. A red bandana held back short, dark hair. She pulled a pair of heavy gloves from her back pocket, slapped the dust off her thighs, and then, impossibly, popped a bubble of gum. What is she? Emmy whispered in Japanese to the woman beside her. The American woman yelled something to a male guard, her voice clear and loud, devoid of the keigo, honorifics, Emmy knew as bedrock. She wasn't a wife, not a mother in the compound. She was working, driving a Gunkyo Toraku, a military truck. This was not propaganda. This was real, and it broke something in Emmy's understanding of the world. 8 months earlier, June 1945, Okinawa. June 18th, 1945, Okinawa. The air was too thick to be air. It was a wet, hot blanket, woven from sulfur, gangrene, and the metallic tang of unshed blood. Emmy Tanaka knelt, her knees sinking into the mud floor of the cave. The only light came from a sputtering carbide lamp that cast grotesque, dancing shadows on the limestone walls, making the rows of wounded men look like a breathing tapestry of death. Her objective, her only objective, was the boy in front of her. He couldn't have been 17. His leg, wrapped in blood-soaked houtai, was a ruin. Water, he rasped, his voice a dry scratch. Emmy dipped a rag into the last canteen. The water was brown and oily. She pressed it to his cracked lips, her movements economical, precise. Ryosai Kenbo, good wife, wise mother. This was the female equivalent of Bushido, to endure, to serve, to facilitate the glorious death of the warrior. Her duty was not to save him, that was impossible, but to ease his passage. The world outside the cave mouth was a constant rolling drumbeat. The American naval guns of Love Hill, an explosion closer this time, sent a tremor through the rock. Dust and small pebbles rained down, fouling the open wounds. She checked the boy's hachimaki, the headband meant to center his spirit. It was soaked in sweat. She had no more morphine. She had no more bandages. She had only her duty, a promise to the Emperor to remain here until the last. A sound, a wet thump, landed near the cave entrance, different from the artillery. She froze. It was followed by a deafening whoosh and a brilliant, terrifying white light. White phosphorus. The oxygen vanished, sucked from the cave in a greedy gasp. The carbide lamp choked and died, plunging them into absolute suffocating darkness. The boy beneath her hands gave a final, rattling heave and was silent. The shelling stopped. The silence that replaced it was worse. It was the silence of the tomb. Emmy's hand, trembling, moved from the boy's chest to the small of her back, her fingers brushing the cold, smooth pineapple pattern of the Type 97 grenade tucked into her belt. Her duty to the living was over. Her final duty remained. A scrape of a boot on stone, a click, a small, steady flame erupted in the darkness, illuminating the face of an American Marine, his face smeared with black paint, his Zippo lighter held high. The flame blinded her. Emmy didn't hesitate. Her fingers closed around the grooved steel of the Type 97 grenade. She fumbled for the pin, her thumb searching for the ring, her mind screaming the single word, Tenno Heika Banzai, for the Emperor. This was the correct death. She never found the pin. A shadow detached itself from the Marine. A second figure, this one wearing a helmet with a red cross crudely painted on its side, crashed into her. He was impossibly large, a wall of muscle and gear that smelled of sweat and canvas. His helmet struck her jaw, and her head snapped back, hitting the limestone. Stars exploded behind her eyes. He yelled something in his barking, guttural language. His gloved hand, covered in dark mud, clamped over hers. He wasn't gentle. He twisted. Emmy felt a sharp, agonizing pop in her wrist as he wrenched the grenade from her grip. He cursed, scrambled back, and threw the grenade deep into the cave's recesses, shouting, "Fire in the hole!" Emmy lunged, screaming, not at him, but at the lost grenade. He had stolen her death. He had stolen her honor. "Kill me!" she shrieked in Japanese. "Kuros, kill me now, you demon!" The corpsman ignored her. He saw the grenade was a dud or too far away. He turned back, his face a mask of grim efficiency. He grabbed her shoulder to hold her down. Emmy thrashed, biting and clawing, her nails digging for his eyes. "Kuros." "Shut up." "Jesus," he grunted, shoving her flat. His eyes scanned her. They stopped on her leg. The hakama trousers were soaked, a darker stain blooming from a shrapnel wound she hadn't even registered. He drew his knife. Emmy's breath hitched. Finally. She closed her eyes, preparing her soul. She felt a rip, not a slice. He was cutting her trousers, exposing the wound. "No," she whimpered. "The dishonor." He was looking at her. He pulled a small paper packet from his web gear, tore it open with his teeth, and dumped a yellow, stinging powder, sulfur, directly into her flesh. The pain was white-hot, eclipsing the grenade, the shame. He followed it with a thick bandage, wrapping it with rough, practiced speed. He had saved her. This act was the ultimate violation. He had marked her as Horio, a prisoner, a creature lower than any beast. He tore a block of dark brown chocolate from a box, a K-ration, and jammed it at her mouth. "Eat, Tabaru." She spat it out, seeing it as poison. Angered, the corpsman grabbed a length of communication wire from the floor, roughly bound her hands and hauled her to her feet. He dragged her, stumbling and weeping, from the tomb of her comrades, out of the darkness and into the blinding, terrifying daylight of a captured world. The days blurred into a gray, humiliating smear. Emmy became cargo. She was herded with hundreds of other captured men onto the sun-baked deck of an LST, landing ship tank. The journey from the beach to the massive transport ship waiting offshore was a gauntlet of stairs. The American Marines, chewing gum and leaning on their M1 rifles, looked at her with a lazy, bovine curiosity. It was the Japanese men who radiated contempt. She kept her eyes fixed on the deck plates, her bound hands clasped tight. She could hear the whispers, the sibilant, cutting sounds just loud enough to carry. Ianfu, comfort woman, Urajirimono, traitor. She, a nurse from a respectable family, was now indistinguishable from a camp follower. Her capture had erased her past. The processing was impersonal and brutal. They were stripped, their heads shaved. Then came the white rain. Emmy stood in line, naked under a thin smock, as American soldiers in masks wielded spray guns attached to metal canisters. A cold, chemical-smelling cloud of white DDT powder enveloped her, stinging her eyes, coating her scalp, settling in a bitter film on her tongue. It was a process for delousing livestock, not for treating humans. They were shoved below decks into a cavernous, poorly lit hold. The air was stifling, thick with the thrum of the ship's engines and the smells of diesel, unwashed bodies, and vomit. For weeks, this was the world. Emmy found a corner, drew her knees to her chest, and tried to disappear. She was the only woman in the hold. One day, she recognized a man being helped by two others. Major Kondo, an officer she had once bowed to at the Shuri Field Hospital. He was pale, his arm in a sling, but his eyes were clear. Their gazes met. Emmy instinctively lowered her head, a gesture of respect beaten into her since birth. When she looked up, he was staring straight through her. His face was a mask of granite. He did not see her. He refused to see her. To acknowledge her would be to acknowledge his own capture, his own shame. In that moment, Emmy Tanaka ceased to exist. The Major's gaze had confirmed it. She was an unperson, a ghost haunting a steel hull, floating between a dead past and an impossible future. The engines finally changed their pitch. A new rumor spread. Riku. Land. They were herded up to the deck, squinting in the harsh sunlight. It was not a small island. It was a continent. A vast, green, impossible coastline stretched as far as she could see. They were put on a train. For 3 days. Emmy stared through the grime-caked window, her hands still loosely bound. The country did not end. It was an exercise in terrifying, demoralizing scale. She saw mountains of scrapped metal, fields of wheat stretching to the horizon, and factories belching smoke. This was not the weak, decadent nation of the propaganda leaflets. This was a titan, and they had dared to prick it with a pin. They arrived at a place called Camp Beale. It wasn't a prison of mud and bamboo. It was a city of identical wooden barracks, painted olive drab, laid out in a perfect, soul-crushing grid. The fences were high, the barbed wire taut, but the gates were wide open, processing an endless stream of trucks and jeeps. The guards were not the savage Oni she expected. They were tall, pink-faced young men who chewed gum constantly. They carried their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. More terrifying than brutality was their boredom. They processed Emmy and the others with the weary efficiency of factory workers. The first true shock came in the mess hall. They were given a metal tray. A soldier dropped a ladle of stew onto it, followed by 2 slices of impossibly white bread, a yellow square of butter, and a spoonful of strawberry jam. Emmy stared at the tray. This was more food, more luxury than she had seen in 3 years. The jam was so sweet it made her teeth ache. The bread was soft as cake. This wasn't a feast. This was, she realized, a normal meal. A deep cold dread settled in her stomach. If this is what they fed their prisoners, what did their warriors eat? She was assigned to a barracks in the small women's compound, segregated from the men. It was stark, but it was clean. She was given a steel cot, 2 thick wool blankets, and a pillow. There was hot, running water. A guard handed her a bundle. She unrolled it. It was a set of U.S. Army herringbone twill fatigues, the fabric stiff, smelling of lye. They had been dyed a deep, conspicuous blue. She slowly removed her filthy, blood-stained hakama and pulled on the enemy's trousers. The fabric was rough against her skin. It was the final surrender. She looked down at herself, a small figure lost in the blue cloth. She was no longer anything. Walking to her cot, she looked out the window. Across the compound, another guard was walking the perimeter. The figure was short, carrying an M1 carbine. As it passed under a bare light bulb, Emmy saw the guard's hair tucked under a cap. It was a woman. They were called WACs, Women's Army Corps. Emmy watched them from the window of the mending room where she now spent her days. They were not jofu, prostitutes, as the propaganda had insisted. They were heitai, soldiers. This fact was a stone in her gut. They wore the same herringbone twill trousers as the men. They walked with a long, ungraceful stride, their hips rolling, not gliding. They shouted to each other, their voices sharp and loud, completely devoid of the respectful keigo that was the bedrock of civilized conversation. They drove jeeps. They carried M1 carbines, the polished wood stocks resting comfortably against their shoulders. Emmy found them repulsive. They were biological failures, women who had abandoned their sacred God-given purpose of ryosai kenbo. They were loud, coarse, and worst of all, they seemed completely unashamed. A week into her internment, 2 WWIIs entered her barracks for a routine inspection. One was tall, with a sharp face and reddish hair under her cap. The tag on her jacket read, PFC Miller. She was chewing gum, her jaw working rhythmically, an act of supreme disrespect. Emmy and the other women stood at attention by their cots. Miller moved down the line, her eyes scanning, bored. She thumped mattresses, opened footlockers. At Emmy's cot, she paused. She reached under the thin pillow and pulled out the one thing Emmy had managed to hide, a small, dog-eared photograph of her mother and father taken in 1938. Emmy's blood ran cold. It was her last connection to Emmy Tanaka, the person. Miller held it up, thumbing the image. "What's this?" Emmy did not have the English words. She only had the terror. She acted purely on instinct. She dropped to her knees and pressed her forehead to the dusty floorboards in a full, desperate dogeza bow. "Kudasai," she whispered. "Please. Onegai shimasu." There was a silence. Miller stopped chewing. "Hey, get up," Miller said, her voice not cruel but annoyed. "What are you doing? Get off the floor." Emmy flinched, staying down. "Geez," Miller sighed. She tossed the photo onto Emmy's blanket. "It's just a picture. Stand up. You're giving me the creeps." Miller walked out. Emmy stayed on the floor, trembling. The whack hadn't been brutal. She had been dismissive. Her power was so casual, Emmy's gesture of total submission hadn't even registered. It was meaningless. That evening, August 15th, a crackle came over the camp's loudspeakers, followed by a tinny, strange voice speaking formal Japanese. The world officially ended. The broadcast was tinny, full of static, but the voice was unmistakable. It was the Gyokuwan Hoso, the jewel voice. Amy had never heard it before. No civilian had, but she knew it. It was the voice of a god, and it was speaking the language of mortals. It spoke of a war not proceeding to Japan's advantage, and of enduring the unendurable. It was not the words, but the sound of his voice that broke them. For a full minute after the broadcast crackled into silence, the barracks was a tomb. The only sound was a low, animal wail from a woman in the far corner. Then, from the men's compound, came the chaos, shouts, the sound of wood splitting, a single, agonizing scream. The camp descended into madness. The war was over. They had lost. Their entire purpose for existence, to die for a victorious emperor, was a lie. A deep, cold despair settled over Emmy. She felt nothing. She was hollow. By nightfall, the camp had fractured. A grim-faced man, Sergeant Watanabe, a gunzo who had maintained a fierce internal discipline, emerged as the leader of the hardliners. He strode through the barracks, his eyes burning with fanaticism. "It is a trick," he bellowed, his voice raw. "A cowardly American lie to break our spirit. Do not listen. To accept surrender is the only dishonor." His followers, men clinging to the wreckage of their Bushido code, seized control of the compound. They sought out the weak, those openly weeping, those accepting the news. They found a young lieutenant, his leg shattered and gangrenous from a wound sustained on Okinawa. He was delirious, but he understood the emperor's voice. He had begged for poison. Watanabe and 2 of his men dragged the lieutenant into the open, laying him on the dirt. They produced a short tanto knife. Watanabe saw Amy watching from her barracks doorway. He pointed. "You, Kangofu, nurse, Come, your duty. Emi's blood turned to ice. He must die with honor, Watanabe hissed. He is too weak to complete the act. You will assist. He wanted her to hold the man's hand steady. He wanted her to witness, to participate in the ritual. Emi looked at the terrified, feverish eyes of the lieutenant. She saw the cave. She felt the grenade in her hand, the corpsman's grip on her wrist. She had failed to die then. No, she whispered. Watanabe's eyes widened. What? I cannot, she stammered, backing away. It was not courage. It was not morality. It was abject, paralyzing terror. Watanabe stared at her, his expression turning to pure disgust. Coward, he spat. You're not Japanese. She fled, locking herself in the latrine, her body shaking. She had failed her honor on Okinawa. Now, she had failed to facilitate the honor of another. She was, by every definition she had ever known, worthless. The next morning, the American guards, terrified by the night's 2 suicides and Watanabe's fanaticism, forcibly separated the compounds and instituted mandatory, closely watched work details. Anything to break the psychological tension. October 22nd, 1945, Camp Beale, California. The mandatory work details were a strange relief. They broke the suffocating introspection of the barracks. Emi was assigned to the camp laundry, a steaming, lye-scented building where she spent hours mending and folding endless piles of olive-drab uniforms. Today, she was on an outside detail, helping unload sacks of soap powder near the main logistics depot. She kept her head down, focusing on the rough, burlap sacks, trying to ignore the casual authority of the WWII guard, PFC Miller, who watched them. Her world had shrunk to this: lift, carry, stack. Maintain composure. Show no weakness. The vibration came first. It wasn't the throaty cough of a Chiha tank or the high whine of a Zero. It was a deep, steady growl that she was beginning to associate with American power. A massive olive-drab 2.5-ton GMC truck was approaching the depot, braking hard in a cloud of fine, yellow dust. Emi paused, sack in hand, and pressed closer to the wire fence. The engine cut. The sudden silence was pierced by the sharp click-clack of the driver's door opening. A figure swung down from the cab. Emi's breath caught in her throat. It was a woman. She wore men's denim trousers, rolled high over heavy work boots. A red bandana held back short, dark hair. She pulled a pair of thick leather gloves from her back pocket and, with an air of complete unconcern, slapped the dust from her thighs. Then, impossibly, she popped a bubble of pink gum. Emi stared. This was not a whack. This was not a soldier. This was, she realized, a civilian. The woman yelled something to a male supply sergeant, her voice clear and loud, carrying easily on the dry air. She gestured to the truck bed, and the sergeant nodded, grabbing a clipboard. This was not propaganda. This was not a trick. Emi's understanding of the world fractured. The WWIIs were one thing. They were Heitai, an anomaly of war. But this woman was normal. She was driving a Gunki Yotaraku, a military truck, as if she were carrying vegetables to market. All the propaganda, all the teachings of Ryosai Kenbo, all the deeply held beliefs about the structure of the world didn't just seem wrong. They seemed irrelevant. They were lies told by men who had never seen this place. The woman's power wasn't a weapon. It was casual. It was functional. And in that moment, it was the most devastating thing Emi Tanaka had ever seen. She couldn't reconcile it. She found herself staring at PFC Miller, the WWII guard, no longer with revulsion, but with a new, terrifying, and desperate curiosity. Her curiosity was a dangerous, burning thing. It focused on PFC Miller. Emi was returned to the mending hut, a small, quiet barracks that smelled of soap and canvas where she and 3 other Japanese women repaired the camp's uniforms. Emmy was a master seamstress. It was part of her upbringing. A woman's stitch was a reflection of her soul, patient, invisible, perfect. She worked with her head down, her needle flashing, making the rough olive drab fabric whole again. PFC Miller was often the guard on duty, bringing in baskets of torn HBT trousers and field jackets. She would slump in a chair by the door, rifle resting against the wall, reading a comic book or chewing her gum. Emmy watched her from beneath lowered eyelids. She observed how Miller interacted with the male guards, with easy, loud jokes, often hitting them on the arm. It was the behavior of a brother, not a subordinate. One afternoon, Miller brought in a pair of HBT trousers with a massive L-shaped tear across the thigh. She tossed them onto Emmy's workbench. "This one's bad. Need it by 1600. Got it?" Emmy didn't understand the words, only the urgency. She nodded, bowing her head. She picked up the trousers. The herringbone twill fabric was thick, stiff as a board. This was a challenge. She threaded a fine needle and began the painstaking work. She would repair this as her mother had taught her, using tiny invisible Shinkawa stitches that pulled the weave together from the inside. It would take hours, but the repair would be stronger than the original fabric, and just as beautiful. It was an act of pride. An hour later, Miller got up, stretched, and looked over Emmy's shoulder. Emmy flinched, but kept working. Miller watched for a full 30 seconds. Then she let out an exasperated sigh. "What in God's name are you doing? It's a pair of pants, not the damn emperor's robe." Before Emmy could react, Miller took the trousers from her. She pulled a housewife sewing kit from her own pocket, threaded a thick needle with coarse olive thread, and plunged it into the fabric. Her stitches were huge, crude, and powerful. Stab, pull, stab, pull. In less than a minute, she had closed the tear in a violent, ugly seam that looked like a scar. She tossed the trousers back. "See? Done. Faster, honey. It just needs to work." Emmy stared at the brutal, functional seam. It was hideous. It was perfect. It worked. A thought, cold and clear, entered her mind. We spent 3 hours perfecting a single stitch. They built a continent. She picked up the next pair of torn trousers, and her hands trembling, forced herself to make a large, ugly, functional stitch. She began to listen. Needle. Thread. Broken. For 2 weeks, Emmy practiced the ugly, functional sewing. Faster. It just needs to work. The philosophy infected her. In the quiet of the barracks at night, she practiced her new words, matching them to the Japanese she knew. Needle. Hari. Thread. Ito. Broken. Kawareta. A new, terrible feeling was growing in her. Atrophy. She was a kangofu, a nurse, but her knowledge was dormant, sealed away by a language she could no longer use. She watched one of the other women in her barracks suffering from a terrible, racking cough. Emmy knew she needed fluids and salicylates, but she didn't know the word. Her professional identity, the one thing she had left, was dying. She realized, with a cold sickness, that her pride was killing her skill. The women driving the trucks, the whacks with their crude stitches, they were functional. She was ornamental. The next day, in the mending hut, she waited. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through the blue-dyed HBT fabric. PFC Miller was there, same as always, chair tilted back against the wall, chewing her gum. Emmy put down her sewing. She stood up. Miller's chair slammed flat on the floor. "What? You need the latrine?" Emmy walked slowly toward her. Every step was an agony. This was worse than the dogezabao. That was submission. This was asking. This was admitting inferiority, admitting need. She stopped 3 feet from the whack. She bowed, a short, clipped gesture, not the deep bow of submission. No, she started, her voice a croak. She held up her hands, palms open, as if holding an invisible book. She mimed turning pages. Han, she said. Book. Miller frowned. A book? You want a comic book? No. Emmy shook her head. She mimed reading again, then pointed to her own temple. Knowledge. Then she pointed across the compound toward the infirmary. Byoki. Sick. She looked Miller in the eyes. Watashi, Byoki, Yomu, I, sick, red. She mimed her nursing actions. Kangofu. Miller's jaw stopped chewing. The blank, bored expression on her face flickered. She processed the gestures, the broken words. She looked at Emmy's intense, desperate eyes. She looked at her small, capable hands. The WWII nodded. Once. A brief, sharp gesture of understanding. A flicker of something new passed across her face. Not pity, not annoyance. It was respect. A medical book, Miller said, as if to herself. I'll see what I can do. 2 days later, during the distribution of Red Cross parcels, Miller slipped a thin, olive-drab manual into Emmy's hands. FM 2111, First Aid for Soldiers. Emmy hid it in her cot, her hands shaking. That night, by the dim barracks light, she opened it. It was full of crude diagrams of tourniquets, pressure points, and splints. She began to read. It began in late January 1946. The first man died quietly, dismissed by the overworked American camp doctor as simple influenza. By the third day, 20 men were sick. By the fifth day, the men's compound was a hell of dysentery. The smell hit Emmy first, a sharp, acidic stench of sickness that cut through the winter cold. The lone American doctor, a weary major awaiting his own discharge, was completely overwhelmed. He ordered a quarantine, but he lacked the manpower to enforce it. Inside the barracks, men were groaning, curled up on cots soaked in filth. They were dying of dehydration. Emmy knew what this was. And from her study of the FM 2111 manual, combined with her nursing training, she knew exactly what they needed: cleanliness, boiled water, and salt. The camp had received a massive shipment of Red Cross parcels just a week prior. Emmy knew, as everyone knew, that those parcels contained soap. They contained multivitamins. And they contained salt packets. She also knew, as everyone knew, that Sergeant Watanabe had confiscated them all. He claimed it was for orderly distribution. In reality, he was hoarding them, rewarding his inner circle of hardline loyalists and letting the weaker men, those who had accepted surrender, those without rank, suffer. He saw the epidemic as a cleansing fire, a way for the weak to die the dishonorable death they deserved. Emmy's hands were tied. She was a woman. She was a Horio. She had no rank, no authority. She could only watch, her gut twisting in a knot of professional shame. She was walking past the quarantine barracks when she heard a low, choking sound. She slipped inside. A young prisoner, barely 19, was lying on the floor, his eyes rolled back, his body shuddering in the unmistakable convulsions of severe dehydration. His skin was pale, waxy. Emmy stared. The world dissolved. It was June 1945 again. She was in the cave. The air was thick with gangrene. The boy on the ground in front of her was dying, and her canteen was empty. She was useless. She had failed him. She had run. This new boy, the one dying on the floor of the American barracks, gasped, a dry, fish-like sound. Something inside Emi Tanaka did not break. It set. It was the cold, hard certainty of a professional. The identity she had been raised with, the submissive, enduring woman, the Ryosai Kenbo, was a luxury for a world that no longer existed. The identity she had earned, the Kangofu, the nurse, was an imperative. Sergeant Watanabe's hierarchy was a lie. The only hierarchy that mattered now was life over death. She stood up. Her terror was gone, replaced by a cold, white-hot focus. She knew where Watanabe kept the supplies. She turned, her footsteps precise and silent on the wooden floor, and walked out of the quarantine hut, directly toward Watanabe's bunk. Sergeant Watanabe was sitting on his cot, polishing a pair of captured American boots. Two of his loyalists sat nearby, sorting through cigarettes. They looked up as Emmy stopped directly in front of them, blocking their light. Watanabe's hands stilled. His face hardened into a mask of contempt. "This is the men's barracks, Horio," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You are not permitted here." Emmy did not bow. She did not lower her gaze. She kept her eyes locked on his. The silence in the barracks became heavy, absolute. "They are dying," she stated in Japanese. Her voice was not the voice of a woman pleading. It was the voice of a nurse giving a diagnosis. Watanabe slowly rose to his feet. He was a head taller than she, a solid block of muscle and fury. "You have no rank," he hissed. "You are a coward who refused her duty on the day of our surrender. You are nothing." "And you are a killer," Emmy replied, her voice shaking but unbroken. "You are hoarding the salt. You are letting them die. I am a Kangofu. I will not." Watanabe's face turned purple. "You dare!" He took a step toward her. His two men moved to flank him, cutting off her exit. This was it. This was the cave, all over again. The moment of choosing. He had been right about one thing. In his world, the world of Bushido and military rank, she was nothing. She had no power, but she was not in his world anymore. She took one step back, out of his immediate reach, and did the one thing he could never have anticipated. She turned her back on the Japanese hierarchy and appealed to the American one. "Guard!" she screamed, the English word tearing from her throat, raw and loud. "Guard! Help! Byoki! Sick!" Watanabe froze, his hand raised. He was momentarily paralyzed by the sheer audacity, the betrayal. He lunged, not to strike, but to silence her. The barracks door slammed open. "Hey, what the hell's going on in here?" PFC Miller stood framed in the doorway, her M1 carbine held at. The ready. Emmy did not run to her. She stood her ground. She pointed, not at Watanabe, but at the cot, at the stacked Red Cross parcels beneath it. "Medicine," she shouted, her broken English sharp and functional. "He hides medicine. Men are sick. Byoki. Need salt. Need soap." Miller's eyes instantly took in the scene. The furious sergeant, the two henchmen, the small, rigid woman, and the cache of hidden supplies. She understood the power play. She chambered around. The clack-clack echoed in the tense room. "Back off, Sarge," Miller ordered. "Give the nurse the boxes. Now." Watanabe stared, his authority evaporating. The American guard, the wrong woman, had just validated Emmy's rank over his. Defeated, he stepped aside. Emmy walked past him, knelt, and began hauling the life-saving supplies into the light. April 1946. Kure, Japan. The voyage home was the reverse of the first. The ship was quiet, the mood somber. Emmy stood on the deck, her blue-dyed POW uniform replaced by a simple dress provided by the Americans. She was no longer Horio, but she was not sure what she was. She was returning to a country that believed she was dead, or worse, dishonored. She clutched a small canvas satchel. Inside, nestled beneath a bar of soap and a chocolate ration, was the oilcloth-covered FM 2111 field manual. It was the only thing she owned that made sense. The ship sailed into the harbor at Kure, a vast naval base that was once the pride of the Imperial fleet. Emmy gripped the railing. There was nothing left. It was not a city. It was a flat gray expanse of pulverized concrete and twisted steel skeletons, stretching from the docks to the foothills. The skeletons of giant cranes slumped into the harbor, their arms rusted and useless. The air smelled of cold ash, salt, and decay. This was the nation she had been taught was divine and invincible. This was the honor Watanabe had been so desperate to protect. It was all gone. A profound aching emptiness opened inside her, a grief too large to process. They were herded down the gangplank onto the shattered docks. American GIs, looking impossibly tall and well-fed, directed the flow of silent, gaunt returnees. Emmy stepped onto the soil of her homeland, feeling like a complete alien. What place is there for me, she thought. What place for a woman who shouts at men and reads American books? Then she saw them. A few hundred yards away, a work crew was clearing rubble from what had been a main road. They were all women. Their heads were wrapped in tenugui scarves, their bodies clad in patched, faded Monpe work trousers. They were thin, their faces smudged with soot, but they worked with a grim, rhythmic efficiency. They lifted heavy stones, swung picks, and pushed wheelbarrows. Emmy stopped. She had seen American women driving trucks out of choice and industrial power. She was now seeing Japanese women clearing cities out of sheer, brutal necessity. The shock she felt at Camp Beale was not an anomaly. It was a preview. The old world was gone. The roles were shattered, burned away with the cities. Survival demanded functionality. Emmy looked down at her own soft hands. She adjusted the satchel on her shoulder, feeling the hard corner of the medical manual press against her side. She took a deep breath of the cold, ash-filled air and began to walk, not toward the refugee center, but toward the women with the picks,